Of the day is Peter McNulty. Peter, what do you do for SAP?
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so I'm in the product management organization, and I support SAP Cloud Platform workflow and business rules.
Thank you for that. And for those of you that are familiar with myself, I've been at SAP quite a long time, and I think Peter's beat me out by a couple of years, so he's got a lot of knowledge on a lot of topics. It's a real pleasure to have him on the phone with us today. And Ricky Cheng, what do you do for SAP?
Thanks. Ricky Cheng. I'm a solution engineer focused on the SAP Cloud Platform, so all things SAP Cloud Platform.
Awesome. And so the reason why we've got 3 people is that we do have a fair number of people attending or starting to attend these calls, which is great. And so as a result, Ricky's going to be just dedicated to making sure that you get the answers to your questions. So do not be shy with the questions, just keep them coming. And at the end, if there's anything that has not been addressed, we'll try to address it at the very end. And I know in the last session we went a little bit long, so we didn't kind of get through all the questions, but we'll try to be a little bit more on track today. So without further ado, let's get into it. So before I let Peter have at it with the workflow service itself, we just want to give a quick, when we talk about SAP Cloud Platform, today we're covering one service of many. And of course, in the SAP Cloud Platform, we have these broad buckets of services, which you can see on the screen. So there's no need for me to go into them, all of them. But at the end of the day, they're all available. And, the expression, I think it was from Aristotle, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This is an exact, you'll see that today, which is why that's so important, I think, and so relevant, because you'll see that when we use the workflow service, workflow service sits there, and it has some capabilities, but often it's used in conjunction with other services in the platform. So I think that'll become very, very aware. And so far in the series, we did a session on integration. And also, actually, we did 2 sessions kind of on integration, because we did one pure play system to system. We took some content, we enabled it, and we did some tweets into Hybris sentiment analysis. That was our first one. And then the last session, also in the integration category, was API management. And so we did those 2. And so today, also kind of in the grouping or category of integration, kind of related to DevOps, is the workflow service, because it's a technical thing. You're using it to build things, potentially orchestrate services. But that's where we're going to focus today. And now going forward, we've got another 2 or 3 planned out to the end of the year. So I'll just make this ask of people that are out there. So the ask is, if you have other ideas for topics that you would like to see covered in 2019, please send me a tweet. So my Twitter account is ScottDillon1, or send me an email, scott.dillon@sap.com, and say, hey, I listened to your series, or tweet it out, listen to your series. Would love to see this topic covered in a future session, because these sessions are for you. And so let us know that you're interested. Let us know the things that you're thinking about, or even provide us with a use case that we could walk through. So before Peter jumps into the session, here's a quick poll. So we need you to participate. So essentially, select an option. I think you can select multiple if required. It was to give Peter a sense for how many people have heard of workflow, have touched workflow in the SAP system before. Just get in there and click a few buttons, and we'll just give this maybe 30 seconds, and then we'll move on to the presentation piece. So we've got, right now we got a lot of people are familiar with SAP Business Workflow. We got 15% are familiar with the SAP NetWeaver BPM. Okay, we got a small percentage that are on the Cloud Platform Workflow. You notice, of course, I put my bias in that option, the best one. That's just me being a little bit funny with you. Okay, so you can see that a lot of people are really focused on, or have been focused, of course, because ECC and S4 have been around a long time. Many people got exposure to the concept of workflow by using ECC. So, classic scenario, somebody creates a purchase order and they want to have it approved, vetted in some way, shape, or form. This is really good. This is gives us a good. So, see, Peter, you can see from the screen instantly that a lot of people they're not unfamiliar with workflow, but they are familiar with it as it exists inside the ABAP environment and how that would be structured. So today, this will be a good intro into another way to do workflow. So this is really good. All right, everybody, thank you for that. We're going to move right on to the next one. Thanks for that instant feedback. So, Peter, I'll push on to the next slide, and I'll let you drive it from here.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Without any further ado, we're going to talk about the SAP Cloud Platform workflow. I'm just going to give a very quick introduction because I really want the tools to speak for themselves, and you're going to see that as we build a workflow application from scratch. So the main thing I really wanted to convey is this first statement is rapidly build new workflow-based applications or extend standard application workflows with SAP Cloud Platform. So what does this mean? Well, the first word, rapidly. So rapidly, or we can also talk about developer productivity. What this basically means is what you'll see is it's model-driven. We're working with the workflow editor and laying out the flow of our workflow. We do also have the flexibility to work with APIs. So what I really like about our approach to workflow, you can take advantage of model-driven, but you're not sort of locked into a paradigm because extensibility via these APIs was really kind of baked in from day one. There's other techniques that are not really going to be shown in this, but business rules, which really add to the agility, meaning through a business rule, you can drive the behavior of the workflow and set and empower business users. But hopefully this will be a future garage session. So the main things I want to convey is from a developer standpoint, the workflow editor, it's based on BPMN, Business Process Modeling Notation. We use open standards. So for instance, you'll see REST and OData is the way to interact with the workflow service. We also have the My Inbox application. And see, I saw a number of people already have a background. So if you remember the universal work list, just kind of think of the My Inbox is really providing a similar capabilities, but it's all using Fury, and it's embedded in the Fury Launchpad, and we'll see some details of that momentarily. And additionally, I know that everybody's not also a developer, but for the admins, we want to kind of give a preview of the monitoring and administrative capabilities. And as Scott mentioned, workflow is really not used standalone. It's used in conjunctions with other applications and services. So openness is very critical to this, and that's why we're going to see, HTTP-based connectivity and these REST APIs to actually manage the workflows and tasks. So let's get a little bit more detail. So the first thing I want to present to you is the workflow editor. Now this editor is actually part of WebIDE. So the nice thing about that is if you're using WebIDE to create your UI5 applications, you can easily configure through the preferences of the WebIDE to get the editor. And just some basic idea behind this, we see on the far left-hand side, we see the palette of the BPM or the BPM palette where you can just drag and drop these shapes onto the diagram. And with each of the shapes and even the workflow itself, you'll see the workflow properties or the properties that corresponds to the BPM activity appearing in the properties which you can set. So this is just some general information. And we also see, if you look at, for instance, the business key, which I'm highlighting, we'll get into a later explanation. But this is essentially the data which is used in the workflow, and it's always predicated with the word context. And this $ bracket is based on Java Unified Expression Language. So the other thing I want to call your attention to, and this is where end users will basically receive or get their tasks. So this is the My Inbox. And this application in the left-hand side, we see the task list. So these are tasks that you're eligible to work on. And we can also sort and filter these. For instance, you see, high and very high as priorities, and even overdue. You can sort and filter these so that you work on those items that are most critical first. And in the middle of the screen is the actual UI5 application or task UI. that was developed to be used as part of the workflow. So in this example, we're basically presented with a new hire in this case, and they have the option of basically adding new equipment. And on the far right-hand side, we actually see the workflow log or the execution of what it's done, and you can see information on when it was started or not. An interesting thing about this confirm or change equipment, this is an example that's actually available to you as part of the sample apps. So if you're using a trial account, we ship an employee onboarding example, and this is really an extension scenario. So the idea behind this is when there's a new hire created in SuccessFactors, SuccessFactors has this concept of intelligent services, which basically allows you to extend the capabilities of SuccessFactors for additional processes. And what we do in this sample app that we deliver is we basically, through a business rule, determine the equipment based on the employee's job role. The manager can optionally book new hire training, and this is going to interface into Concur. But the idea is this simple example, I think, really drives home the value of workflow, because we're taking a system like SuccessFactors and piggybacking on the functionality to onboard an employee and make them as productive as possible from day one. So this is a quick overview of the My Inbox. The next screen I want to kind of show, and this is for the administrators, where you can monitor the actual workflows that are in flight or running. And some of the things we can actually do is instantiate or start a workflow directly from this tool. You can download the workflow models in a JSON format. You can basically look, but I think that the most useful thing from my perspective is really from troubleshooting. So you can look to see the status. Is the workflow running? Is it an error? If it is an error, you can see the error message. And one of the important things is what is the data that's actually being used in the workflow or the workflow context. And you can see that in the lower portion of the screen. So this gives the administrator effective diagnostics to really kind of troubleshoot, the workflows that are deployed and actually running in your landscape. So with that in mind, I also want to kind of step back and kind of give you an architectural or a bigger view of how this all plays together. So as I mentioned, the design time is done in the SAP Web IDE. This is where we'll see the workflow editor. I also mentioned the workflow samples, this employee onboarding, so you can play around or look at some of the features in workflow. And within the Web IDE, and I'm sure that you know this is used for UI development and UI generation. But one of the things, if we look at the workflow editor, we see there's a hook into the API Business Hub. So this is the idea that when you're creating a service or you want to talk to a system of record, you can basically use the API to find those available services or interface. Now, once we finish with the design time, we actually deploy it onto SAP Cloud Platform. And here in the top portion of the screen, the end users, and the common thing here, whether it's a custom UI application that you developed, the My Inbox and the Monitor Workflows, these are two Fury-based apps that are delivered out of the box. The common thing is that the users are interacting with UI5 and My Inbox. So the look and feel of the applications, regardless of whether the workflow is just an extension to one of the LOB or cloud applications, or it's basically transcending an end-to-end process where we're starting in SuccessFactors, we're creating POs in S4, and maybe travel requests in Concur, an end-to-end scenario. But from an end-user perspective, everything's looking the same. And some more details, if we look at the workflow service in the middle, so one of the things, as I mentioned, this is using HTTP or REST to kind of talk to these different services. And you may find yourself in a situation, well, my system of record is based on SOAP or, web services or IDOC or anything. So can I use workflow in this capacity? And the answer is yes, because what you would do is introduce cloud integration, and this can handle all the protocol mediation, principal propagation, all these things that you would need to make that seamless and make that system of record first-class citizen in the workflow by proxy. So that's a general overview. We can see the connectivity with the S/4HANA. And the last thing I want to call your attention to is you can work with on-premise systems. We would be going through the SNC, and the cloud connector would be provided in the case of SAP systems to really enable this to fit in. So that's a very quick introduction, and these concepts will be reinforced in the demo. So at this point, Scott, I'd like to kind of turn it back over to you. Scott, are you on mute? Scott, I think you may be on mute.
Can you hear me now, Peter?
Yes, thank you. Okay, good to go.
Perfect. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. I just I plugged in for power and then I lost you. Okay, so we're back at it. Thank you, everybody, for the few instant messages. Who can't hear you? So we put a quick poll just to see which of the features that Peter just talked about, if they resonate with you. So because some people say, you know what, I want to do my workflow in the cloud. Some customers say we don't want to do any workflow in the cloud. Some people are really interested in the BPMN and the notion of that and how that would work. So in terms of reuse, open standards, but that'd be interesting to see that if you want to provide some feedback. So what I need to do now, because this, of all the pieces that we've done so far in terms of the in the Garage series, the previous ones have been pretty self-contained, and unfortunately, you know, the goal was to have everybody follow along and actually do the exercises virtually, but it's extremely difficult in this case, and you're going to see why quickly. So on the left, you will see a little person that's there, and John Doe wants to register for this session. So the scenario that we've cooked up is if someone's using a UI5 form and they want to submit some data, but there's a process that needs to be layered on top of that, rather than hardwire it and directly connect it to the back, what we're going to do in this case is we're going to have a UI5 application invoke the OData API call for the workflow service. And basically, that's going to be responsible for kicking off the workflow service. And then everything that you see in the cloud is basically self-contained inside of SAP Cloud Platform. And you can see here already, like we have an optional link to the business rules. We have a direct connection to a HANA database. So for this exercise, I built out a small, HANA table, 4 or 5 fields that would contain the registration information. And in addition, there's 2, you'll see an email task as well that's used. And so that's just an overview of the scenario. We're going to get everyone to try it, or as many people as you want to try it in about 2 minutes from now when I get through the other prerequisites. So prerequisite number 1, you need something. And in this case, we use the UI5 application to start, but you need something to start the workflow. And that could be an event, that could be something in ECC, that could be something in a legacy. Doesn't really matter. As long as you can call a REST service, you can kick it off. The next thing, of course, you need is a Fiori Launchpad, because the tools to monitor and keep an eye on the workflows and to access the inbox, they're all part of the Fiori Launchpad. So you got to have that configured, which is embedded into a portal site. And then the other little ones, you need a Cloud Platform account. You will need an email address. You need, of course, to have access to the Web IDE. And for those of you that may be new to the call today, the Web IDE, the integrated development environment, a tool from SAP that lets you do all your development in a browser for a variety of different objects. And it used to only be UI5, but now it's HANA, it's Java, it's workflow. The tool is becoming very, very robust and quite comprehensive. And you need a HANA database to store the data. Now, I chose to use a HANA database. Again, anything that could be accessed via a service call, you could have used instead, and you can modify this scenario to make it your own. The last two, of course, we have the destination that needs to be created. So if anybody has been doing UI5 Fiori development, they recognize this concept of a destination. I kind of think of it as it's an abstraction to where you're pointing to on the back end. So in this particular case, we've created a destination called customer, and you will see that reference later. So basically, customer points to a HANA database table that has been exposed as OData. Now that topic in particular is interest to you, and you want to see that covered in the next Garage series, guess what? Tweet me, write me an email, send me a text. So, and the last piece, of course, is the Fiori inbox. And so I've highlighted on the screen here an important point, because in the Fiori inbox on the left, you've got your items that are delivered to the inbox. And on the right, you're going to see today, like this is, the Garage is all about doing simple scenarios that we think will resonate, and then people can take them and build upon them from there. So in this particular case, it's a 4-field custom user interface, but it could be 20 fields, it could be 50. You'll have to implement that, and we're going to show you today how to get started and do that. Last but not least, before we pop right in, and we're about 3 minutes behind, but that's okay, the workflow context. What exactly is it? So you're going to see today, and in the very middle of the screen, there's a context object defined here called, and it's probably a little bit hard to see, but it's called attendees, and there's 4 fields associated with that. The context is the place where the workflow service will go to get information that it needs to operate on top of. So if we want to have a decision, as an example, maybe we want to automatically approve all attendees that are employees, as an example. So that piece of information has to be located somewhere in the context so the workflow engine can look at it and then take it and then use it. So you'll see on the left-hand side, as part of the configuration for the workflow, we're referencing here a context element. So there is a little bit of script and there's a format associated with it, but I want you to know that that is referencing essentially a variable inside the context structure. And the same thing on the right-hand side where we have the service task, it's also represented or calling a context element called attendees. So that's just important for you to know. And then last but not least, we have starting the workflow with UI5. So you will see, again, in about 30 seconds, we created a small application for you to try, and you basically fill out the fields and you submit, enter. And so this little application that you see here on the left, you'll fill it out, you'll hit register. And you can see down below, right below it, it says OData, attendees, we have some fields. This is where the context is defined, and this is the context that is sent to the workflow engine. We are not prescribing what the context needs to be. This is completely open. So if you wanted to do one for work orders or sales orders or inspections or retail articles, whatever that may be, you can use. The other second point that we use here, the APIs that we will use and are embedded in this small piece of code, they're all documented on the API Hub. And in our last session in the Garage, we talked about API management, and we showed you how to take content out of the API Hub, which is another interesting one. So what I want to do now is give you access to this URL. So from a participant perspective, if you click that URL, you should be prompted, I'm hoping, with an application. And I'm going to share my screen shortly, and I'm going to do it along with you just so at least one person does it, but I'm hoping you will cooperate and send me a few messages. Hold on. I'm going to start this, try Reflector 3. So what I'm going to do now is pop back. Just give me 1 minute, people, 30 seconds, 40 seconds. I'm going to pop back. I'm going to go into screen sharing mode. And so what should happen on your screen is that the media player should be overtaken by a screen share once I hit this share button. So in about 15, 20 seconds, you should see my screen. And what you should see are two things. One, you should see the bigger screen inside the browser window. Pedro, if you receive an email, by all means, put it in the chat box there or do something like that. So anyway, that's a very quick introduction. And just the other thing we want to show here is that this registration list, what we're going to show next is how to incorporate into the HANA database, which has been successfully done. All right, so Peter, let me go back for 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 minute.
Hey, Scott, I think people were having issues with getting audio and video. I see your video's back on now.
Yeah, so you only see one of the two. So in general, when people, when I'm sharing my screen with the On24 software, the video disappears and it overtakes, the presentation will overtake the video window. And then when we come back to slides and polls and surveys, the video cameras should reappear.
Okay, but the point is, Scott, we're not seeing your screen in the audience view.
Right, so now I'm basically going to make this poll. I'm going to push to the audience. Let me know if you see that now. Do you see the poll now, Peter and Ricky, in the live view?
In the live
People are
view,
answering it
now, yes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. So we're getting some feedback here. And the point we wanted to make with that quick overview, and we're going to jump into the demo now because we're running a little bit short on time, is just to show you how easy it can be to extend a UI5 application with the workflow capability. So Peter, without further ado, enough PowerPoint already. Am I right? So let's get in and see how this would work. So I'm going to go right back to the screen share, and we're going to build this scenario right now. So I'm going to share my screen. You let me know, Peter, when you can see it, and I'll pop in to the cockpit. Do you see the cockpit, Peter?
No, Scott, there is. Oh, okay, there we go. Good. Good. Okay. Thank you, Scott. Everybody, we're in the cockpit of Scott's trial account. And the first thing, Scott, what I'd like you to do is navigate to the services. because we're going to just walk through some of the initial setup that people will need to do. And from the drop-down all categories, if you would select orchestration, and we'll see 2 services, workflow and business rules. So if you would, and the important thing here is for those that are listening, is that these services are enabled. For this demo, obviously just the workflow, but I would recommend enabling business rules as well. But for now, if you would click on that workflow tile.
Okay.
Okay, good. And now what we see in the Take Action box, there's a Configure Service link, if you would click on that.
Absolutely.
All right. And now, so the workflow service already sets up some destinations. These come pre-configured, so we don't really need to spend time on that. But if you would click on the roles in the left-hand panel, and the important thing here is, if you can see, there's 9 roles delivered. And Scott, just resizing the screen is really good because what you want to do is assign your user ID to all of these roles. And of course, in a production scenario, you can limit based on the users, et cetera. But for the interest of this demo, you just want to make sure that your user ID is assigned to all these roles. So this is good from the initial setup. And now we can actually go back, or if you click on the workflow service breadcrumb, just to the workflow service.
Oh, you want to go back to the workflow service?
Yeah, okay. Because what we're going to do at this point is launch the SAP Web IDE full stack. So if you would click on this, and there's just a few steps we need to do to configure this, and then we can, then we're really cooking with gas. So.
All right.
So we'll just give a moment as the Web IDE loads.
Yeah, I think I had it kind of just sitting there in the background. I'm going to hit a refresh, and hopefully it won't take too long to come back. And in the meantime, if anybody has any questions, feel free to submit them through as we're going along. Okay, we're good to go, Peter.
All right, good. So the first thing we need to do with the Web IDE is, if you see those icons on the very left-hand panel, the very last one is the preferences. If you would click on that. Okay, and now if you would scroll down under Workspace Preferences and Features. Good, if you click there. And now if you just scroll all the way down to the bottom here, you'll see the Workflow Editor. And what you need to do is make sure this is on. Perfect. Okay, so this is good. So now you can click on the second from the top icon on the leftmost to return to the development. Okay. And now what we're going to do is maybe you want to close some of those. Yeah, perfect. Okay, and now what we want to do is create a new workflow project. So from the workspace, right-click, New, and it's Project from Template. And here from the category, select the drop-down Business Process Management.
All right.
Okay, and now we can walk through the wizard.
How's that?
All right, and finish.
All right.
All right, so if you're following along, what should appear here is the workflow diagram, and it's already defaulting with the mandatory start and end events. And just to give a check for those of you on the phone, what we want to do is have a UI form where a user can either approve or reject the registrants. So just to clarify, the registration form that you guys completed, that was a start UI. And that basically triggered or created a workflow. What we're creating or will be creating momentarily is a task UI. And the difference is that the task UIs are part of the workflow, and the task UIs will appear in my inbox. So that's a key difference between the start UIs that are invoking a workflow and the task UIs that are actually going to be used in the actual execution of the workflow and shown in the My Inbox. Scott, why don't you, from the BPM palette, use the drop-down so we can see that these tasks are organized by category. So just expand that. And what we want is a user task. So why don't you just select the user task and drop that onto our diagram. Okay, that's good. Now, at this point, we're going to need to associate a UI to be used as part of this user task. Now, there's a couple different approaches we can take with creating these user interfaces. So you can either create the UIs first and add the plumbing code to make them available in the workflow, or what we're going to do in this example is generate a workflow task UI, and then we're going to add the UI. So, Scott, if you would click on the Garage workflow project and right-click and say New. And we're going to select the workflow task UI, and this will prompt up a wizard for us. So just select that item. Okay, so this is taking care of all the plumbing code for us, but let's have a quick look at that. So why don't you expand that approved garage item and the web app folder. So what we see here at a very high level, we have the application descriptor file, which is this neo.app.json. And within the web app, you're going to see that the main or the bulk of the work is going to be in the component.js. And this generation is very modular. So if we expand the model as well, the model folder, we'll be working mainly with the context and the component.js. But let's look at the component.js as a starting point. And I just want to kind of walk through, exactly what's kind of going on here so that you have an overview. So if you would just basically scroll down a bit. So in the init function, which we're seeing, one of the first things we need to do is get the task instance ID. So a workflow instance is obviously a running instance of the workflow, and a task instance is the UI task that's part of that. So we can see that we have this wrapped in a try-catch blocks where we're getting the task ID. And the next thing we need to do is read the task instance data and create a JSON model from it. And if we scroll down a little bit, that's where we can see that happening as well. And on line 72, you actually see the binding. So the binding is going to allow that to make it available in the user interface for us. Now, one thing we also want to do is in this callback action, Scott, if you would, so our data model here, as he's highlighting, we're referring to it data is the word. But in the this callback action, we just want to add append to our context model. So Scott, around about line 101, if you would just add a new field. And what we want to do is just basically append the value that's going to be a result of the check action. So if someone approves or rejects it, that value is going to be assigned a little bit indirectly into our context so we know, and we're going to use that in our workflow. So we basically are setting the value to whatever true or false is set in this in this stage. So very good here. So if we scroll further down, what's also generated for us is adding these custom action buttons, and you can see them in the add action if you scroll further down. Yeah, so this is basically generating for us, and this is generating the buttons on the form for the approve or reject, and of course you can extend this as well. And then the last thing of note is really after the task is completed, we want to refresh the task, which is this last function, refresh task at the bottom. But the important thing is we also need to write this information back into our context or our workflow data. And this is where we're going to now navigate to the model or the context model JS. And one of the things with all the workflow APIs, you're basically going to need to first get this XRF token. The XRF token is a security measure to thwart against cross-site security attacks. And what you do is once you get that token, you need to pass it. But what's interesting here is the function. So we're getting the XRF token, and then we see yet another AJAX nested call. And for those of you not familiar with this, this is jQuery. So I'm sure the UI5 developers will be right at home. But we're calling this workflow API. The method is a patch because we're modifying the workflow context for this task instance or the task instance context. And we're calling that information and, of course, passing the XRF token in the header. So this is all generated for us. And the next thing what we need to do is work on the presentation or the visualization. So, Scott, maybe now if you would expand the view from the tree pane.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Okay, yeah, just the view.
So, Peter, just before we pop into that, so just I want to recap what I heard there. So there's two files. When we build this task UI, essentially the template that sits and the functionality that's inside the web IDE, you specify create a task, UI, and then from there, the code that we saw, for the most part, 99.9% of it doesn't have to be touched because it aligns with the standard kind of workflow item page whereby you've got the two options, reject and the approve. And if that helps, or if that fits in the scenario that you're trying to do, and you don't need to add 6 more buttons or 10 more fields, really you're just modifying that one line that we did, and the other code that's there, you don't have to touch that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, exactly. It's generic. It'll work in all situations. And as you pointed out, if you just need the accept and reject, you're good to go. So this is really kind of taking this plumbing, and as you'll see, it's consistent in every task UI. And if you approach this differently, if you created the UI first, then you could simply take this code and add it to your component JS to achieve the same effect. So it depends on the angle you're approaching, but you are exactly right. This is going to take us 99% of the way there, but you do have the flexibility to go in, add additional buttons depending on your use case. Right. Now, we're in the app view XML. Now, the point here is, in the interest of time, we cannot really kind of teach UI5. So what we're going to do is just, cut and paste this snippet that we already prepared that's basically showing the elements that we reused from our registration form, and we're just going to replace this in this section. Yeah. So just a simple cut and paste.
Just to highlight the comment here, it does tell you right in the comment for the component that's generated. Everything from here is just an example. So the idea is you would put in the look and feel, logo, properties specific to your company, your scenario, your use case. And so when I'm replacing this form with this one, basically what we're doing is we're saying, hey, the people that submitted that registration form earlier, they put in a first name, a last name, an email address, an attendee role. Let's grab those out of the context and let's display those in the inbox form. Is that accurate?
Exactly. And Scott, one thing I always like to do is also look at this in the layout viewer, just to give me an idea what this is going to look like. So, yeah, the layout editor, excuse me.
And Peter, I have to be honest, I've never gotten really a lot of points for making things look pretty. So yeah, this is the best I could do. Like left aligned is my strength.
Yeah. But the important point, Scott, here is the data binding. So what we see in data was that sort of structure that was generated, our JSON model. And then after that, we see the context attendee and the attributes that are underneath this structure. And this is the information that the workflow is expecting. And if you remember, once this information is filled in, that along with the status of whether they approved or rejected will be sent in that workflow API that's in the context model JS via patch, or an update.
Beautiful.
So,
Beautiful.
So very good, Scott. So we're done with the UI generation at this point, and we can go back to the workflow diagram.
All right, now, Peter, we've got 10 minutes to get this working. I'm just no pressure, but let's move it.
Oh, okay, no problem. So click on the user task, and the first thing we need to do is click on the details first. If you would just do the details before we forget that, Scott.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So we can give a subject, and this subject can be parameterized using the workflow context data. We already just kind of prepared this so we can we don't have to watch Scott typing so much. So.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is the subject line, and this is going to make it very easy once we see these items in the inbox to do it. Now, the very important thing is, who do we want to work on this? And since this is Scott's trial account, it's going to go to his inbox. So if you would put your user ID. Great. Now there's other things we can do, configure due dates. We can have boundary events, et cetera, if the date's exceeded. But we'll save that for another call. Why don't we click on the user interface properties, because what we want to do is associate that task UI that we created with this user task. So if you would just click the select button to pick from our project. So the garage, yeah, there we go at the end. Okay, and then also the UI5 component, which you created, perfect. And we click OK. All right, good. So we're done with the task. So the next thing we want to do is add a service task. So a couple ways you can do the speed buttons, which are visible right now. You can select the speed button, so the third from the bottom, to create a service task and drop that onto our palette. Or if you're more comfortable using the palette on the left-hand side, you can do that as well. So we want a service task. Okay, great. And now what we want to do with the service task is point to your HANA service that you expose, or your database service that you expose. So click on the details. And the first thing is the destination, which you already mentioned. So we want to fill in this with the customer destination. Mm-hmm. Okay. And now we can actually choose where we're getting the service. So if you hit this drop down, we'll see that you can also use the API Business Hub. So if you wanted, the APIs from SuccessFactors or Ariba, you could just get them directly from the API Business Hub. But since this was a custom development service, we're going to just choose others. And if you would select that. Scott, did you select it? Scott?
Maybe we lost Scott again, Peter.
Okay.
Hey, Peter, while we wait for Scott, maybe I'll ask you a question or two for you to clarify.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So there's one question around the mail task. Can you talk a little bit about what you can do in the mail task, and if you can do things like approve or reject via mail?
Well, you can use the APIs if you want, but the email task that we're going to show as part of this is really going to be a confirmation whether your registration was either approved or rejected. And the options are we can either use plain text or HTML templates. But, just like we created that registration UI from the Start UI, what you can actually do is, generate, you can basically invoke these APIs externally from the work service. And that's really one of the primary benefits, is that there's APIs to do most of the tasks that you want. So you have a high degree of flexibility there. So just status check, Scott, or are you back?
It looks like Scott has lost power at his house.
Yeah, he said his power just came back on, so he might be joining us. He said there's also tornado warning there, so Scott is in some stormy weather. But
so Peter, maybe I'll ask you another question on that came up.
Sure.
There's a question about the ability to deploy workflow on premise.
Okay. You mean from the cloud? The answer is
yes.
The answer is no. The workflow actually gets deployed to the cloud, and the reason being is, if you're familiar with NetWeaver BPM, although there's some things in common, i.e. the workflow editors are both using BPMN 2.0 palettes, the underlying architecture is vastly different. So, for instance, the BPM product is based on Java EE or Java Enterprise Edition, whereas the cloud product is basically, as we saw, it's utilizing, and I see Scott's back, but fundamentally the architectures are, yeah, we can, Scott, yep.
Okay.
And I'm just kind of looking to see if your house is still intact with the tornado coming through.
It's crazy. My phone went off with a tornado warning. We lost all the power. So now I'm connected in with my cell phone, of all things, instead of a landline. Isn't that ironic? Anyway, did you want to try to finish, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, I think if those on the phone, we can wrap this up in another 5 minutes or so. So why don't we, if we can go back to, are you in a position where you have or do you need to log back onto your, okay, good. You're at a good starting point. So from the service task, and what we need to do now is you need to fill in the path. So if you would fill in the actual path. So this path actually gets appended to the destination, so we would see the full URL if we were to bring it up. And now the other interesting thing is, well, we're passing and making a call to insert a record into the database, so we need to basically send this in the request variable. So we're just sending the attendee into the request variable, and we can, that's it for the service task. Okay, the next thing what we want to do, and Scott, maybe it's easier, we just want to add 2 email tasks, one for approve, one for reject.
Okay.
Okay, and maybe we just name them approve and reject so we don't get confused. Excellent.
All right, I got 2 of those.
All right, good. And we'll configure these momentarily. But now if you would delete the connection from the user task to the service task for the time being, you can delete, you can delete both of them actually, the connections there. Okay, and yep, perfect. Now what we want to do is add a gateway, and a gateway is going to control the flow. So from the user task, if you click on that, use the speed buttons. The second from the bottom is a gateway, and we want an exclusive gateway, which means that the workflow is going to follow one path and not the other, as opposed to a parallel where both would be executed in parallel. So now what we need to do is draw a connection from the gateway to the service task. Okay, and also from the gateway to the rejection email. Okay, good. And now what we need to do is configure the sequence flow. So if you click on the one that's going to the reject, I'm sorry, you're on the approve. Yeah. Mark the reject as the default because what we're basically doing is we're assuming nobody's going to be approved. So that's going to be the default unless we explicitly grant that. So that's that done. And if while you're on the reject, you can also connect that to the end event as well.
Okay.
We'll get into the details momentarily. Now for the approval flow, if you click on the approve sequence flow from the gateway, not the email, yeah, there we go. And one thing, if you're looking, if you see these little red triangles, that means that the information is either incomplete or inaccurate. So let's fill out the approval sequence. And here we want to do is check the value that was returned from the context or what the state is. So here we put this variable in a stage context. So if we just say the context stage equals true, then we're going to update the database. And now if you would connect the service task to the approval email, and then the approve to the end event. And the very last thing that we need to do is just configure these email tasks with, the subject and the body of the text, which we're going to do now. So for the approval, if we click on the details.
Okay.
Yep, so we need the two. And we're just going to cut and paste.
So Peter, again, this is grabbing an entry from this context structure where we have these data elements, right? So we could go in there, grab something from there, and use it to personalize the email, correct?
Exactly. It's like a mail merge. That's exactly what it is. Same for the subject. We can put that in, and as we can see, we can parameterize that or just use static text as well. And if you really wanted to be creative, you could also change it from plain text to HTML and have a template for really nice. But this is good enough for our purposes. Just keep it at plain. Now, we also want to do the same for the reject, and we have that indication that it was incomplete. So this is pretty much more of the same.
Okay. 30 seconds here.
Yep.
Get that done. I was losing my house there for a minute. It's crazy.
Yeah, you had us worried. Okay. And the same with the. All right. But I promise you, folks, within 5 minutes. Okay, great. Now we're all done with this. So deploy the workflow, and I also want you to deploy the Garage project so we get the task UI as well. All right, so we should see a success message in the upper right-hand corner. And now if you go to the Garage Workflow project, deploy that as well. And so we get the newly created task UI. All right, that looks good. And let's give it a second or two. All right. So we don't have to register this at the moment. What I'd like you to do now, Scott, is if you would bring up your registration form. If we all remember, this is going to kick off or start a workflow, and it's going to pass in the payload, and that's what's going to instantiate our workflow context. Okay, make sure you refresh this. Yep, okay. Okay.
Employee, register.
Okay, register. All right, that looks good. Now toggle over to the FLP. We'll just have to do a refresh. Now I just want to give a quick preview, excuse me, of the workflow admin tools. So as this is refreshing, I just want to, for the administrators on the phone, just show you what we have to work with.
I've got to sign out and sign back in. Timed out.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So if you click on the monitor workflow definitions, okay, and if you click on the Garage workflow, or yeah, that's what we just created, And if you basically click on Show Instances at the bottom, okay, we see that there is a running instance. And if you scroll down a little bit, we can see the context that Scott typed in. There's no error messages, so we can see that there's now a task open. And where are we going to find this task? It's going to be in the My Inbox. So if you click on the home icon in the upper left-hand corner, okay, and then click on the My Inbox, you're going to be a busy man, Scott. You have quite a few things to approve, but and of course you can sort these. But I think you know, the latest one should be on top. We can look at that. So if you would approve this or reject, depending on your mood.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So at this point, the workflow is completed. We could check that in the workflow definitions. But an easier way is Scott created a tile. Now we see the registration list for the garage is now at 2. So if you click on that, we should see an entry for that. Now, if you want to, Scott, and I leave that up to you, for the other workflow that the users were doing, you can kind of approve that and we can see those entries coming in. But the last thing I'd like to show is if you would just launch your Gmail account, I believe that was the service that you won, we should see a confirmation email as well. And there it came in. So that was just a mini workflow that we had shown. Once again, there is a sample that basically shows more advanced workflow things, but the purpose of this session was just to really show you the tools in action from start to finish, to really get your comfort level and what you need to do to set up the environment and create your first workflows. So with that, I'm done. And Scott, if you have any concluding comments, or Ricky, if there's questions you want to bring up to us, fire away. I realize we're just a little bit over, so I want to thank everybody for their patience. And if you need to drop, you know, thank for your attendance.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. Great job. I have put up a small poll here. This gives us the ability to interact with you more closely should you wish to do so. Obviously, there's a yes and a no, but you can be assured the reason of these sessions is to provide information, and that's the goal. But if you found something today interesting and you think to yourself, hey, you know, my company could really huse a scenario like this, you want to hop on the phone with myself and or Peter, or have us come visit you, kind of walk through how it works, show you in a real scenario, just hit yes, and we'll reach out to you in the next couple of weeks. Feel free to do that. And of course, it's Q&A, number one. So we've got this Q&A section now, but I know we're kind of over time, so we won't spend too much there. But of course, we have the next ones that are coming up. So on the 26th of September, we have the SAP Cloud Platform portal. So we'll try to get in there, show people how to, you know, register an FLP with a site, create a regular site, unstructured content. And on the 24th of October, we're planning to do a similar session with rapid application development by Mendex. And then the two that are at the end of the year, we're kind of in flux with those, but the plan is at the moment to do mobile and then IoT. And then last but not least, I will be at TechEd. If you want to get together at TechEd, have a coffee, discuss any of the sessions that we have done so far and or will do, I'm down there. Again, send me a tweet, ScottDillon1. You'll find me pretty easily. And let's grab a coffee. You'll often find me in the developer area near the latte machine. So that's all good. But anyway, it's been a good session. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and keep the feedback coming so we can make them better and better. I'm just going to do a quick recap of the questions, just in case anybody's still on. Can you do, it looks like almost all of them were answered, and the last one is in the middle of being answered. So it looks like we're good on the Q&A front. Ricky's been doing an amazing job. So thank you, everybody, for coming out.